the winter of hollow souls, when the cold consumed the impoverished people of 1960s Appalachia. This narrative reaches far beyond simple tales of freezing temperatures or economic struggle. What unfolds here is a record of how seclusion, despair, and forbidden pairings forged an inheritance that would shadow generations in the remotest recesses of the Cumberland Mountains. December 1963. While the nation grieved for a slain president and readied itself for the holidays, deep within the Appalachian wilderness of eastern Kentucky, the Hadley family confronted their own particular darkness. Their secluded hollow, called Whisper Creek by locals, lay 23 miles from the nearest settlement, reachable solely by a treacherous dirt path that became unnavigable for half the year. For over 130 years, the Hadley clan had made this remote valley their home. Their origins had taken hold in the rocky earth back in the 1830s. What commenced as a pioneering household seeking liberty and property had gradually morphed into something considerably more ominous. Geographic seclusion became genetic seclusion. The very mountains that shielded them also held them captive. Thomas Hadley, aged 61 during that 1963 winter, stood as the head of this deteriorating bloodline. His weathered countenance told tales of struggle, his bent back bearing witness to generations of intermarriage within his own family tree. Thomas wasn't merely the family leader. He himself was the outcome of a first-cousin relationship, his parents being the offspring of two Hadley brothers who had wed two Hadley sisters back in the 1890s. The family homestead comprised 4 deteriorating wooden buildings clustered around an iced-over stream. 17 individuals called this place home, though labeling it home would be overly generous. The biggest cabin sheltered Thomas, his wife Martha's, who also happened to be his second cousin, their 6 offspring and 3 grandchildren. The genetic repercussions of their familial customs were apparent on nearly every face. Sarah Hadley, the youngest daughter of Thomas and Martha, was 19 that winter. Unlike her siblings, Sarah had entered the world with comparatively few obvious irregularities. Merely a slight crossing of her eyes and an unusual way of walking. But Sarah harbored something her family had attempted to conceal across generations: a mind keen enough to grasp their circumstances, and a spirit courageous enough to desire freedom. That year, winter arrived ahead of schedule. By mid-November, snow had already entombed the valley beneath 3 feet of white stillness. The Hadleys were accustomed to brutal winters, yet this season delivered something unprecedented. A relentless chill that appeared to penetrate both flesh and spirit. Temperatures plunged to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the gale screamed through the hollow like some injured creature. Food stocks shrank rapidly. The family's meager corn harvest from autumn had been ruined by an early freeze. Their 3 undernourished pigs had been butchered by Thanksgiving, and the meat was nearly finished. The nearest government aid office sat in Harland, a town that might as well have existed on another planet, given the impassable roads and the family's profound distrust of strangers. But hunger wasn't the sole problem confronting the Hadleys. In truth, it scarcely marked the beginning. Thomas had reached a decision that December, a choice grounded in generations of distorted custom. His grandson, a 15-year-old Daniel, would be united with Daniel's own aunt, 23-year-old Rebecca, Thomas's daughter from his initial marriage. Such arrangements weren't unprecedented in Hadley history. The family tree resembled less a tree and more a tangled vine, coiling back upon itself in ways that transgressed both legal and natural order. Rebecca sat beside the failing hearth in the main cabin, her hands trembling not from cold, but from awareness of what was anticipated from her. Her body displayed the scars of earlier family unions, 3 children who hadn't survived infancy, each afflicted with conditions the family whispered about, but never identified. Her face, prematurely aged at 23, exhibited the characteristic traits common among the Hadleys: widely spaced eyes, a prominent forehead, and teeth growing in disordered patterns. Daniel, despite being merely 15, already topped 6 feet in height, though his posture was stooped, his shoulders uneven. He had been born with a cleft palate that had never received proper treatment, leaving his speech hard to comprehend. His hands shook continually, a neurological condition running through the Hadley bloodline like some dark current. Sarah observed this developing catastrophe with mounting dread. She had educated herself through old newspapers and periodicals that occasionally reached the hollow, abandoned by the rare coal company surveyor or itinerant preacher. She comprehended what her kin refused to acknowledge. They were destroying themselves, one generation after another. The outside world knew almost nothing of the Hadleys. A social worker named Margaret Chen had attempted to visit the hollow in 1961, but Thomas had confronted her at the property line with a rifle and explicit warnings. The county sheriff, swamped with his own concerns and content to ignore mountain families wanting seclusion, had never pursued Margaret's concerns. As Christmas neared, the temperature fell further. The creek froze solid. The wind tore boards from the cabin walls, and inside the largest structure, Thomas Hadley assembled his family around the dying fire to announce the union that would occur on Christmas Eve. The Hadley family's genetic decline didn't happen overnight. It resulted from deliberate choices made across 4 generations. Choices emerging from a poisonous blend of isolation, religious extremism, and a distorted understanding of family loyalty. The pattern had started with the family's originator, Jeremiah Hadley, who arrived in Kentucky in 1831 with his wife and 3 sons. Jeremiah was a religious fundamentalist who believed that mixing blood with outsiders would weaken the family's spiritual purity. When his sons reached maturity, Jeremiah prohibited them from seeking wives in neighboring communities. Instead, the sons wed their own cousins, daughters of Jeremiah's brother, who had settled in an adjacent hollow. By the 1880s, this practice had become family doctrine. The Hadleys married only other Hadleys. When the family expanded, it did so through progressively closer unions. Brothers married sisters from other Hadley branches. First cousins represented the most distant relation deemed acceptable. By the 1920s, uncle-niece pairings had grown common. The genetic consequences emerged gradually at first. A child born with an extra finger here, unusual facial features there. But by the 1940s, the effects had become undeniable and devastating. Thomas's own childhood had been marked by watching siblings perish. Of the 12 children his mother had borne, only 4 survived past age 10. The others succumbed to conditions that modern medicine would identify as direct results of inbreeding: severe intellectual disabilities, catastrophic organ failures, skeletal abnormalities incompatible with life. The survivors bore their own burdens. Thomas's older brother, Joseph, inhabited the smallest cabin, a man of 45 with the mental capacity of a 6-year-old. Joseph spent his days rocking rhythmically, speaking in fragments about people only he could perceive. His existence was simultaneously tragic and a warning that the family refused to heed. Martha, Thomas's wife and second cousin, had her own painful history. She had given birth to 9 children. 3 were stillborn, their small bodies interred in unmarked graves behind the compound. 2 others died before reaching their first birthday. The 6 who survived all displayed markers of their heritage. The eldest, Samuel, was 34 and had never departed the hollow. He suffered from severe developmental delays and required constant supervision. His face was asymmetrical, his left eye positioned noticeably higher than his right, his jaw misaligned in a way that made eating difficult. Margaret, 32, had been married at 16 to her uncle, Thomas's younger brother, William. That union had produced 2 children before William froze to death during a hunting trip in 1959. Both children exhibited signs of the family's genetic burden. One was deaf and partially blind. The other had legs of unequal length and required a handmade crutch for mobility. The pattern repeated with cruel regularity. Each generation carried the weight of preceding generations' choices. The family tree had become a prison, and every child born within its twisted branches was sentenced from conception. Yet the Hadleys weren't unique in Appalachia's most remote territories. Throughout the Cumberland Mountains and beyond, scattered families practiced similar isolation. The Whittaker family, the Fugate family, known for their blue skin caused by methemoglobinemia exacerbated by inbreeding. The Cult family in Australia. Though across an ocean, the pattern was universal isolation plus insular breeding equals genetic catastrophe. What rendered the Hadleys particularly tragic was their awareness. Unlike some isolated families who genuinely didn't comprehend the connection between their marriages and their children's suffering, Thomas knew. He had observed the pattern. He had buried the evidence. Yet he continued enforcing the family's twisted traditions. That December evening, as wind rattled the cabin walls and snow piled higher against the doors, Thomas explained his reasoning to anyone who would listen. Outsiders couldn't be trusted. The family's purity must be preserved. God would provide for those who kept the bloodline clean. His words were the same justifications his father had employed and his grandfather before him. Sarah listened from the corner, her stomach churning with fury and helplessness. She had attempted to speak against the planned union between Daniel and Rebecca. Her reward had been a backhand across the face that left her cheeks swollen for 3 days. In the Hadley compound, questioning tradition was equivalent to blasphemy. Rebecca sat near the fire, her hands resting on her hollow belly. She knew what was approaching. She had endured this before with her previous marriages within the family. The fear in her eyes wasn't about the ceremony itself, but about what would inevitably follow another pregnancy, another child born with conditions that would make life unbearable, another small grave in the frozen ground. Daniel, for his part, seemed almost detached from the situation. His neurological condition left him in a perpetual state of confusion. He understood he was expected to participate in some important family event, but the full implications appeared beyond his grasp. Perhaps that was a mercy. The scientific reality of what happens when close relatives reproduce is well documented. Humans carry an average of 1 to 2 lethal recessive genes. When unrelated people have children, these genes rarely match up, but when relatives breed, the likelihood of both parents carrying the same harmful recessive genes increases dramatically. The closer the relation, the worse the outcome. First cousin marriages increase the risk of birth defects and genetic disorders by approximately 3 to 4% above the baseline. Uncle-niece unions double that risk. Parent-child relations, which had occurred at least twice in confirmed Hadley history, according to county records from the 1920s, create almost certain catastrophe. The Hadleys displayed a constellation of conditions consistent with severe inbreeding, intellectual disabilities, skeletal abnormalities, vision and hearing problems, reduced fertility, higher infant mortality, and decreased overall life expectancy. The average Hadley lived to just 52 years, compared to the national average of 70 in 1963. As Christmas Eve approached, the temperature in Whisper Creek dropped to 20 degrees F. The family's fuel supplies were nearly exhausted. The food was almost gone, and the ceremony that would perpetuate another generation of suffering was being prepared with grim determination. Christmas Eve 1963 dawned with a sky the color of old bruises. The temperature had stabilized at 218 degrees, cold enough that breath froze instantly, creating ice crystals that hung in the air like suspended glass. Inside the main cabin, preparations for the evening ceremony consumed everyone's attention. Martha and the older women cleaned the main room as best they could, sweeping away debris and arranging the few pieces of furniture to create a space for the family gathering. The fire was built up using the last of their good firewood. The rest would have to come from green wood that would smoke more than burn. Sarah had been assigned to prepare Rebecca for the ceremony. The two women sat together in a small side room, barely larger than a closet, where Rebecca's few possessions were kept. The silence between them was heavy with everything that could not be said. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not want this, Sarah. You know I do not want this." Sarah's hands trembled as she helped Rebecca into the cleanest dress the family owned, a faded floral print that had belonged to their grandmother. "I know," Sarah replied. "None of us want this, but Father will not be moved. The last 3 babies," Rebecca continued, tears streaming down her weathered face. "They suffered so much, Sarah. The sounds they made. I can still hear them at night. Little Thomas lasted 6 days. 6 days of watching him struggle to breathe, watching his body fail him. And Father says, this is God's will." Sarah felt her own tears coming but forced them back. "It is not God's will. It is Father's will. There is a difference." Rebecca looked at her younger sister with desperate hope. "You understand. You have always understood. Why can the others not see what we see?" "Because seeing would require them to admit what they have done," Sarah answered. "Every child they have brought into this world under these circumstances, every union they have arranged. To acknowledge the truth would be to acknowledge their guilt. It is easier to call it God's plan than to accept responsibility." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas's heavy footsteps in the hallway. Both women fell silent, fear automatic and instinctive, but he passed by without stopping. His attention focused on other preparations. In the main room, Daniel sat on a wooden bench, being instructed by his grandfather about his responsibilities. The boy, whose mind operated in fragments and confusion, nodded along without comprehension. His hands shook violently, a symptom that had worsened with age rather than improved. "You understand what is expected tonight?" Thomas asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. In his twisted worldview, he genuinely believed he was preserving something valuable. Daniel nodded, though his expression showed no understanding. "Yes, grandfather. Rebecca is your family, but she will also be your wife. This is how we keep our bloodline pure. This is how we honor those who came before us. Do you understand?" Another nod, another empty affirmation. Joseph, Thomas's brother, rocked in the corner, humming tunelessly. His presence was both witness and warning, though no one acknowledged it as such. Samuel, Thomas's eldest son, sat nearby, his asymmetrical face showing the same vacant expression it always carried. As evening approached, the family gathered. 17 people crowded into a room designed for perhaps 8. The fire provided minimal warmth, and everyone kept their coats on. The smell of unwashed bodies, smoke, and desperation filled the air. Thomas stood at the head of the room, a worn Bible in his hands. The ceremony would not be legal or recognized by any church or state, but legality had never been the Hadleys' concern. This was about tradition, about maintaining walls that had been built over generations. Rebecca was brought forward, Sarah supporting her as her legs threatened to give way. Daniel was positioned beside her, his confusion evident, but his compliance automatic. The family formed a loose circle around them. Thomas began to speak, his words a mixture of biblical verses, taken out of context, and family doctrine that had no basis in any religious teaching. We gather today to unite two branches of our family tree, to strengthen the bonds that have sustained us through hardship, to preserve the purity that sets us apart from the corrupted world beyond these mountains. At that moment, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through Thomas's speech. "This is wrong." The room fell silent, every eye turned to Sarah. Thomas's face darkened with rage. "What did you say?" His voice was dangerously quiet. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she continued. "I said, this is wrong, Father. Rebecca does not want this. Daniel does not understand this. And we all know what will come from this union. More suffering, more children who will not survive, more pain that we will call God's will when it is nothing but our own stubborn refusal to see the truth." Thomas moved towards Sarah with frightening speed for a man his age. His hand rose, prepared to strike. But before he could, something unexpected happened. Martha, his wife, spoke. "She is right, Thomas." Everyone turned to Martha, shock registering on every face. Martha had never in over 30 years of marriage contradicted her husband publicly. "What?" Thomas's hand lowered slightly, confusion replacing rage. Martha stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "Sarah is right. I have buried too many babies, Thomas. I have watched too many children suffer. I have seen what our ways bring, and I cannot watch it happen again. Not to Rebecca, not to any child she might bear." The room erupted in chaos. Some family members supported Thomas, shouting down the women. Others, perhaps emboldened by Martha's courage, began to voice their own doubts. Years of suppressed grief and guilt poured out in angry, tearful confrontations. At this moment, I ask you, if you were in Sarah's position, knowing the truth but risking everything to speak it, would you have the courage to say, "This ends with me"? Leave that phrase in the comments if this story has touched something deep inside you. The ceremony did not happen that night. The family splintered into factions, some retreating to other cabins, others maintaining an angry vigil in the main room. Rebecca collapsed in relief and was taken to bed. Daniel, confused by the commotion, was led away by his mother, and outside, the temperature continued to drop. The winter of hollow souls was far from over. In fact, the coldest nights were still to come. The week following the interrupted ceremony brought a cold so severe that it seemed to target Whisper Creek specifically. Temperatures reached 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind cut through the poorly constructed cabins like knives, and the food, already critically low, ran out entirely. The family's division deepened. Thomas refused to speak to Martha, Sarah, or anyone who had supported them. He moved into one of the smaller cabins with his most loyal followers, including Samuel and 2 other sons who still believed in the old ways. The main cabin housed Martha, Sarah, Rebecca, and several others who had begun to question generations of tradition. Hunger became the dominant reality. The Hadleys had always lived on the edge of starvation, but this was different. Days passed without solid food. They survived on melted snow and thin broth made from boiling leather boots and belts. The children cried constantly from hunger pains that no words could soothe. On January 3rd, the youngest member of the family, a 3-year-old girl named Emma, who had been born with a severe cleft palate and developmental delays, died from a combination of starvation, cold, and pneumonia. Her death, while tragic, was also a grim release from a life that had been nothing but suffering since birth. The family buried Emma in the frozen ground, a process that required building fires on the earth for 2 days just to soften the soil enough to dig. Thomas performed the service, his words about God's plan ringing hollow in the bitter air. Even his most devoted followers could see the cruel irony. Their way of life was literally consuming their children. But Emma's death was not the breaking point. That came 3 days later when a coal company survey team, lost in the mountains during a reconnaissance mission, stumbled upon Whisper Creek. The team consisted of 3 men: Robert Patterson, the lead surveyor, and 2 assistants, James Lee and Michael Thompson. They had been attempting to map potential mining sites when a sudden snowstorm forced them off course. Seeing smoke from the Hadley compound, they approached, seeking shelter and directions. What they found horrified them. Robert Patterson, a veteran of World War II, who thought he had seen the worst humanity could offer, later described the scene in his official report. The living conditions were worse than any battlefield I had witnessed. These people, clearly suffering from malnutrition and disease, showed physical abnormalities consistent with severe genetic issues. Several individuals appeared to have significant developmental disabilities. The children were in particularly dire condition, their bodies showing signs of long-term neglect and malnutrition. The cold inside the structures was barely different from outside. These people were dying, and they either did not know how to seek help or were deliberately avoiding it. Thomas initially tried to turn the men away at gunpoint, but Robert's calm authority and genuine offer of help eventually convinced Martha to intervene. She invited the surveyors into the main cabin, where they were able to see the full extent of the Hadley situation. Sarah seized the opportunity. While Thomas was distracted arguing with the surveyors, she pulled Robert aside and told him everything: the generations of intermarriage, the genetic consequences, the planned union between Daniel and Rebecca, the children who had died, the family's refusal to change despite mounting evidence of catastrophic harm. Robert listened with growing horror and determination. "We will get you help," he promised Sarah, "all of you. But you need to be willing to leave this place, at least temporarily. We can arrange transport to Harland, to medical facilities, to social services." Sarah's response was immediate. "I will go. Rebecca will go. Some others might. But my father and his followers will resist. They would rather die here than admit they were wrong." The surveyors left the next morning, promising to return with help. They provided the family with their emergency food supplies, enough for perhaps 3 days if rationed carefully. Thomas accepted the food, but warned that any attempt to remove his family would be met with armed resistance. True to their word, the surveyors returned 2 days later with a convoy that included the county sheriff, 2 social workers, a doctor, and several volunteers from local churches. What followed was a tense 12-hour standoff. Thomas barricaded himself in one of the cabins with his most loyal followers, refusing to come out. "This is our land, our family, our way of life," he shouted through the walls. "You have no right to interfere with God's plan." The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Harold Winters, tried negotiation. "Mr. Hadley, your children are starving. Some of them need immediate medical attention. We are not here to arrest anyone or take your land. We just want to help." "We do not need your help. We need to be left alone." Meanwhile, the social workers and medical team focused on those willing to accept assistance. Martha, Sarah, Rebecca, and 11 others agreed to be transported to Harland. The doctor, examining them in the relative warmth of the transport vehicles, was appalled by what he found. Rebecca was suffering from severe malnutrition, untreated infections, and the lingering effects of her previous complicated pregnancies. Sarah had frostbite on 3 toes. Several of the children showed signs of rickets, scurvy, and other deficiency diseases. Every single family member examined had dental problems, so severe that extractions would be necessary. But the physical ailments were only part of the story. The genetic consequences of generations of inbreeding were documented in clinical detail. The doctor's report, later filed with the Kentucky Department of Health, cataloged a range of conditions: intellectual disabilities of varying severity, skeletal abnormalities, vision problems, hearing loss, speech impediments, neurological conditions causing tremors and seizures, reduced fertility, and a pattern of infant mortality exceeding 70%. As the evacuees were loaded into vehicles, Sarah looked back at the compound one last time. Thomas stood in the doorway of his cabin, rifle in hand, watching his family leave. In his eyes, she saw not anger, but something worse, an absolute conviction that he was right, and that history would vindicate him. The convoy departed Whisper Creek on January 10th. Behind them, 6 Hadleys remained in the compound, including Thomas, Samuel, and Joseph. They had chosen their path, and no amount of reason or compassion could divert them from it. The Hadleys who agreed to leave Whisper Creek entered a world that was both frightening and liberating. The transition was not easy. In Harland, temporary housing was arranged through a combination of church charity and government assistance. The family members were separated into smaller groups, placed with host families who had volunteered to help. This separation, while necessary for practical reasons, was traumatic for people who had never spent a night apart from their relatives. Medical treatment began immediately. Rebecca required surgery to address infections that had gone untreated for months. Several children needed corrective procedures for conditions that should have been addressed in infancy. Dental work alone took weeks and multiple procedures. The psychological trauma would take far longer to address. Sarah emerged as the family's spokesperson and advocate. Despite her limited formal education, her intelligence and determination impressed the social workers assigned to the case. She participated in interviews with state health officials, helped coordinate her family's medical treatments, and began the painful process of understanding just how abnormal her upbringing had been. In February 1964, Sarah gave her first interview to a local newspaper reporter. The resulting article, titled "Forgotten Family: Appalachian Clan's Generations of Isolation End in Tragedy," brought national attention to the Hadley case. The story was picked up by wire services and eventually appeared in newspapers across the country. The public reaction was mixed. Some expressed compassion and a desire to help. Others viewed the Hadleys with disgust or morbid curiosity. For Sarah, reading these reactions was its own education in how the outside world perceived her family's practices. Meanwhile, back in Whisper Creek, the 6 remaining Hadleys faced the consequences of their choice. Thomas maintained his defiance, but the harsh reality of survival without the younger family members became apparent. By March, even Thomas had to acknowledge that they could not sustain themselves alone. A second rescue operation in late March brought the remaining Hadleys out of the hollow. Thomas was hospitalized immediately, suffering from pneumonia and severe frostbite that would ultimately cost him 3 fingers and 4 toes. His resistance had broken, not through reason but through the simple physical reality that he could no longer survive his chosen path. The Hadley compound was eventually abandoned. The cabins, already in poor condition, deteriorated rapidly without maintenance. Within 5 years, the structures had collapsed, reclaimed by the forest. Today, only a few foundation stones mark where generations of Hadleys lived, suffered, and perpetuated a cycle of genetic devastation. But the story does not end with empty cabins. Rebecca, after receiving proper medical care and counseling, made the difficult decision to have no more children. The risk was simply too great, both for any potential child and for her own damaged body. She eventually found work in a Harland textile factory and lived independently for the first time in her life. She passed away in 1998 at age 58, her health forever compromised by her years in Whisper Creek. But her final decades were lived on her own terms. Daniel was placed in a group home for individuals with developmental disabilities. The neurological damage from his genetic inheritance could not be reversed, but with proper care, medication, and routine, his quality of life improved dramatically. He learned simple tasks, developed friendships with other residents, and discovered pleasures his hollow existence had never allowed. He died in 2003 at age 55, outliving the average Hadley lifespan by 3 years. Martha, freed from Thomas's control after his death in 1971, became an advocate for isolated families throughout Appalachia. Working with social services, she helped identify other households living in dangerous isolation and encouraged them to seek assistance. Her insider knowledge of how such families thought and operated made her uniquely effective. She facilitated intervention in at least 7 other families before her own death in 1989. Sarah's trajectory was perhaps the most remarkable. With assistance from a charitable foundation, she obtained her GED and eventually attended community college. She became a licensed practical nurse and dedicated her career to serving rural communities in eastern Kentucky. She married a kind man from Harland, someone with no connection to her past, and adopted 2 children. She never had biological children, unwilling to risk passing on any genetic legacy from her ancestry. Sarah died in 2019 at age 75, surrounded by her adopted children and grandchildren. Her obituary made no mention of Whisper Creek or the Hadley compound. To her community, she was simply Sarah Morrison, beloved nurse, devoted mother, and tireless advocate for the vulnerable. The past she had escaped was buried with her. Thomas Hadley died in 1971, bitter and unrepentant to the end. In his final years, living in a state-funded nursing facility, he maintained that he had been right all along, that the family's downfall came not from their practices, but from their abandonment of those practices. He died believing he had been persecuted for his faith, rather than held accountable for his actions. The scientific legacy of the Hadley case contributed to important research on the effects of consanguinity. Medical researchers, with the family's permission, documented the genetic conditions present across 4 generations. The data helped establish clearer understanding of how repeated inbreeding affects human populations and contributed to genetic counseling practices still used today. The social legacy is more complex. The Hadley case prompted Kentucky to strengthen its child welfare investigation procedures and increase outreach to isolated rural communities. Social workers received better training on identifying and assisting families living in dangerous isolation. Laws regarding marriage between close relatives were clarified and strengthened, though enforcement in remote areas remained challenging. But perhaps the most important legacy is the human one. The Hadleys who escaped Whisper Creek demonstrated that even the most deeply ingrained patterns can be broken. That awareness can overcome tradition. That change is possible even when it seems impossible. The winter of 1963-1964 in Whisper Creek was indeed a winter of hollow souls. A season when the cold devoured not just warmth but hope, not just bodies but futures. But it was also the winter when that cycle finally, painfully, began to break. Today, the Hadley descendants who survived live normal lives scattered across America. Most have changed their names. Most never speak of their origins. The genetic legacy persists in some minor health issues and unusual features that hint at their ancestry. But the social and cultural legacy has been deliberately erased. The hollow where the Hadley compound once stood is now part of the Daniel Boone National Forest. Hikers occasionally pass through, unaware that the moss-covered foundation stones beneath their feet once supported a family's tragic attempt to wall themselves off from the world. The story of the Hadleys is a reminder that isolation, whether geographic, social, or genetic, comes with devastating costs. It is a testament to the courage required to break destructive patterns. And it is a warning about what happens when tradition becomes more important than the well-being of the people it claims to protect. The cold that winter devoured much, but it did not devour everything. Some souls escaped, some lives were saved, some futures were reclaimed, and in the end, that is what matters. If you watched until here, it is because you connected with this true story of survival and courage. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can meet you and know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. If this story impacted you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to understand that even the darkest legacies can be overcome. And remember, behind every historical tragedy are human beings who deserve to be remembered not just for their suffering, but for their strength in choosing a different path. Subscribe to this channel to discover more hidden stories that reveal the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of impossible circumstances.